you to another edition of All Things Fulfilled. We also make these videos available on audio so that they can be played on our podcast as well. And we post them to our website. But we appreciate you being here. This afternoon, it's storming outside and rain, so you'll probably hear some thunder in a moment, maybe throughout the broadcast, and hopefully everything will be okay, that we don't have a lights out kind of situation. At any rate, I wanted to take some time to respond to one of our querists who asked a question about Habakkuk chapter 2, verses 3 through 4 in one of our videos. And this was regarding the phrase, "in a little while." And his question basically was, since the term "in a little while" is used in the prophecy in Habakkuk chapter 2 and verse 3, then why would not the passage that is mentioned in the New Testament that speaks of the little while, why would it not have been fulfilled 1,000 years earlier, according to the querist, since the prophecy was made in Habakkuk chapter 2? Now, we know that there was a destruction of Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar in 586 BC, where the temple was destroyed, etc. Israel, or Judah particularly, went into Babylonian captivity for 70 years, as was prophesied by Jeremiah. And that prophecy does refer to them. And so we're going to talk about that. So we had this initial fulfillment of the prophecy in the 6th century BC, in the destruction of Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar. However, there are some very unique points about the prophecy, some details that separate the fulfillment in that prophecy from Hebrews chapter 12, verses 18 through 28. And if you notice Hebrews chapter 12, verses 26 through 27, it says, "For yet once more, it is a little while," or "yet once more." Actually, that phrase is mentioned in Hebrews 10 and verse 37. In a very, very little while, he who is coming will come and will not delay. But also in Hebrews chapter 12, we have "for yet once more," where he talks about the shaking of heaven and earth, the heaven and earth that was being shaken. So he says, "yet once more" indicates that he shakes not also the earth, but also heaven. And this indicates the removal of that which was being shaken, so that the things which cannot be shaken may remain. Now, Habakkuk's prophecy, therefore, is linked to the prophecy. And the text says, "Behold, the proud, his soul is not upright in him, but the just shall live by faith." That is verse 4. So what we suggest that you do is look at the prophecy in Habakkuk and read not only verse 3, but also read verse 4. Now, the reason I bring this to mind is to point out that Habakkuk chapter 2 and verse 4 is quoted in the New Testament. It's the phrase that says, "the just shall live by faith." Now, that's quoted in a couple of passages in Romans chapter 2 and Romans chapter 1 and the verse is 17, where Paul says, "I'm not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God unto salvation to the Jew first, and also to the Greek," or to the Gentile. And then he says, "For therein is the righteousness of God revealed from faith to faith, as it is written." Now, where was it written? That's Habakkuk 2 and verse 4. "As it is written, the just shall live by faith." Now, we also find that phrase in Galatians chapter 3 and verse 11, where once again he says that the just shall live by faith. And therefore, in connecting the prophecy to the gospel, to the New Testament era, it has both a fulfillment within the context of Habakkuk chapter 2, in terms of the little while and the destruction that was going to come upon Israel at that time, upon Judah particularly. But the fact that verse 4 mentions a prophecy that was yet future, where the just would live not by Torah, but by faith, then we have to look at the fact that that prophecy did not have its ultimate fulfillment within the time of the 6th century. So whenever all the terms of a prophecy cannot be fulfilled in the time of the prophets, we have to look further to see precisely what the prophets meant. And this is why the prophets often were confused about their own writings, because they couldn't understand some things. When you read 1 Peter chapter 1, beginning at verse 10, he says, of which salvation the prophets have inquired, who have searched diligently concerning the things which they prophesied unto you. They were searching what or what manner of time the Spirit which was in them was indicating when it testified beforehand the sufferings of Christ and the glories that would follow. And then Peter tells them that to whom it was revealed that not to themselves, so those things, many of the things that they talked about were not revealed to those prophets, but Peter says, but to us, to those who have received the gospel through the Holy Spirit sent down from heaven, things which angels desire to look into. So Peter was telling them, the prophets inquired about the things that they wrote because they didn't quite understand them. They knew they couldn't fit them 100% or totally within their time frame. So when you see a prophecy like Habakkuk chapter 2, and it talks about the fact that the judgment was going to come in a little while, and then at the same time in the next verse it says, the just shall live by faith, then what it's telling you is that prophecy does have an initial fulfillment in terms of the judgment by the Chaldeans upon Judah in the 6th century BC. But the very fact that it talks about the just shall live by faith, and that does not occur until the time of the gospel after Jesus has died and the gospel is being preached, being therefore the terms by which God accepts man, then we have to see that the ultimate fulfillment of the prophecy does not occur until the time of the last days. That's why the phrases are repeated in the New Testament to show here is the ultimate fulfillment of these prophecies. Now, do we have verses that mention a little while in connection with the end time scenario of the New Testament, in connection with the last days? Now, if there were no mention of them, then we would have no basis and no ground to apply the phrase in a little while to any New Testament prophecy and fulfillment. But if we find that that phrase is being used and the apostles are reaching back into the Old Covenant, to the Torah and to the Tanakh, and bringing this passage over to the time of the New Testament and saying it's about to be fulfilled, then we have to see its ultimate fulfillment was in its antitype in the fulfillment within the New Testament. So let's look and see whether or not the phrase in a little while has an eschatological or end times significance in the New Testament that would show that its ultimate fulfillment would come in the destruction of the temple by the Romans. So I'm going to mention why this is significant a little bit later on, but in the meantime, then check out some of the texts in the New Testament which are associated with the little while. When you read John chapter 14 and verse 19, when the Lord is talking about the Holy Spirit, he's talking about his going away and he's going to send the Holy Spirit. He said it was going to be for a little while. Now, if you know anything about the prophecy of Joel and the Holy Spirit was sent in the last days until the great and terrible day of the Lord would come. So the Holy Spirit's work would continue. That's why we call it the eschatological spirit. It would continue until the great day of the Lord, until the end time, the eschatological day. Now again, in John chapter 16, verses 16 through 19, and I think you will find the phrase in a little while in about 4 verses, maybe about 7 or 8 times, over and over again, when Jesus mentions this, that he's going away in a little while, and then in a little while he's going to return. And the disciples began to question him and ask him, what do you mean in a little while? What's this little while that you're talking about? We don't understand what you're saying about this little while. Now immediately after the Lord talks to them about the little while, he gives them an illustration, the same as he does in Matthew 24, to talk about a woman going into labor and having the birth pangs, because this was an analogy that related to the end time when Israel or Judah particularly, would go through a period of trial and tribulation and pain, and even the church with their persecution, and therefore would do so before the new covenant world would come into being. And the Hebrew scholars knew that this is what this was talking about, and they understood that these birth pangs would be a part of the new age. You can read about them in Romans chapter 8, around verses 21 through 22, and you can also read about them in the book of Revelation in chapter 12. You'll see the same thing. Now, in 1 Peter chapter 1 and verse 6, Peter also talking about the end time, the last days, he talks about the little while, because he says that they had to suffer, if need be, for a little while. They were in these diverse and various trials into which they were going, but the suffering was only going to be for a little while. We have it also in Hebrews 10 and verse 37, connected directly to the coming of the Lord, where the writer says you have need of patience, that after you have suffered a while, you may receive the promise. And then he says in Hebrews 10 and verse 37, he said, for he who is coming will come and will not delay. But when? The first part of the verse says, in a very, very little while. It's very emphatic, very precise. The words used there are mikron, hosan, hosan. And it is in a very, very little while. So very precise, very specific about the fact that the Lord was going to return in a little while. That's what he told the disciples in John chapter 14, verse 19, and John chapter 16, verses 16 through 19. And Peter alluded to it, which I talked about in my 2 Peter video. So I would refer you to go back there and look at those as well. So here we are in Hebrews 10. But then when you look in chapter 12, verses 26 through 27, you see where he talks about the end of heaven and earth. And he says, for yet once more, I will shake the heavens and the earth. And he says this once more indicates the removal of those things that are being shaken. So there was an end of a heaven and earth that was taking place at the time. Now, when he quotes the text from Haggai, because that's where this yet once more is taken from. It's taken from the 2nd chapter of Haggai. And you have basically the same thing in the book of Haggai. But in Haggai, he mentions in connection with the once more, where he was going to shake not only the earth, but also heaven. Haggai says it was going to be in a little while. That means we have to take the term little while from Haggai and apply it within the prophecy, because that's the one that he's quoting in Hebrews chapter 12. And as we've seen, he's already used it in Hebrews chapter 10 and verse 37. So Habakkuk 2, 3, and 4, but also in Haggai chapter 2, 6 through 8, in connection with the shaking of heaven and earth. And the fact that the heaven and earth that he was talking about was already being shaken. In other words, the destruction of that heaven and earth was already in progress. He couldn't have been talking about a material world, a physical world. He was talking about the covenantal world of national Israel, the covenantal world of Israel who clung to the law, who kept the law and refused to accept the gospel. This is what he was talking about. Now, so from that perspective, we can see that, and let me give you one other text, in Revelation chapter 6 and verse 11, when the souls were under the altar, they cried out to the Lord, Lord, how long will you not avenge our blood by those who have persecuted us on the earth? And he said that they were to rest for a little while until their fellow servants, their brethren, had been killed just as they were. So the period of persecution hadn't quite run its course. It was going to continue for a little while, and then after that little while, the Lord was going to return. So we cannot discredit this little while. It's mentioned too many times in the New Testament in association with the eschatological spirit, the coming of the Lord, the coming destruction upon Jerusalem, and the end of a heaven and earth, and even in the retribution, the vengeance that was going to come upon those for persecuting the saints and for crucifying the Lord. And therefore, it places it within that time frame, and we have to see that connection. So Habakkuk 2:4 has to be taken into the New Testament as well. Now, the next thing that we want to point out is and we've already said it, that it talks about the removal of that which was being shaken, and that's Matthew 24:35, Matthew chapter 24 and verse 29 as well, when he talks about the sun, the moon, and the stars would not give their light, the stars would fall from heaven, etc. Now, that language is taken straight from Isaiah chapter 13, verses 10 through 13, when it was a reference to Babylon. It's very, very interesting that it's quoted in Matthew chapter 24, verse 29, which also incorporates the prophecy of Joel, because Joel talked about the sun shall be turned into darkness and the moon into blood before the great and terrible day of the Lord come. But when we see that occurring, we have a connection with Babylon, and that's one of the reasons why the the book of Revelation talks about mystery Babylon. He's drawing a text from that very context to show that it also applied to Jerusalem. And you can see in Revelation chapter 6 also that he talks about the rolling up of heaven as a scroll, right in that same context where we just finished talking about the little while time frame for the persecution of the saints. So when we look at these passages, we can see that the fulfillment was going to take place ultimately in the New Testament time. And when we understand that the temple of which Haggai spoke, when he said the glory of this latter temple shall be greater than the former, he was talking about the temple as a result of the foundation being laid in Zion, which was Jesus Christ. For other foundation can no man lay than that which is laid, which is Jesus Christ. He is that sure and tried stone of Isaiah 28, verse 16, 11 through 16, and also we find that Acts 4:11, neither is there salvation in any other. Why? Because that was the stone which the builders rejected, the same which had become the head of the corner. That's the foundation that was laid in Zion, the true foundation, which was Jesus Christ. And the temple, the new temple, the spiritual temple, was built upon the foundation of the apostles and prophets, Jesus Christ himself being the chief cornerstone. Ephesians 2:19 through 22, and also 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 3 or 4 down through about verse 8. Now, the most significant part, which shows that the in a little while cannot be restricted to the time of the 6th century when Nebuchadnezzar destroyed Jerusalem, is that the events of Hebrews chapter 12 are about the change of the covenant. This is what makes it different from the event in in Habakkuk chapter 2 verse 3, and also in Haggai chapter 2, in terms of anything being fulfilled in the 6th and 5th centuries before. It is because Hebrews chapter 12 places this in the context of the removal of the covenant. Now, if you've been following these videos on Confused Worlds of Futurism, then you will know that I have discussed at length the foundation laid in Zion and the planning of the earth, the planning of the heavens, and the laying of the foundation of the earth, where God would say to Zion, you are my people. And that this was written for time, for a generation to come, where it was a people yet to be created. And then we talked about Isaiah 6, that was Psalm 102:18, and then we talked about Isaiah 65:17 and following about God creating a new heavens and a new earth, because he was going to create Jerusalem and her people a joy. So they would rejoice forever in what God would create. So that's the new Jerusalem. Well, that's the covenantal change that's taking place in the New Testament era, where the old covenant is being permanently removed and the new covenant. And that's why in Hebrews 12, he tells you in verse 18, for you have not come to the mountain that burned with fire and tempest and blackness and the sound of a trumpet, etc., that the people couldn't stand to hear anymore. See, that was Sinai. That was the old covenant. He says, you have not come to that. And yet people do not want us to leave that, when Paul said, you have not come there. Now, to what did he say they had come? Hebrews 12 and verse 23, but you are come to Mount Zion, to the heavenly Jerusalem, to the church of the firstborn, to the spirits of just men made perfect, etc. to the new covenant. This is what they were coming to. So that moving away from the old to the new is the shaking of heaven and earth that the Bible talks about. That's the covenantal change, and one of them was going to be totally removed and leave the other that could not be shaken. Well, the one that can't be shaken is the New Testament, is the new covenant people. So that's what makes the difference, and that's why the "in a little while" and the judgment upon Jerusalem was so significant, and why that phrase could not be fulfilled in the 6th century BC, but had its ultimate fulfillment in 70 AD when the Lord destroyed Jerusalem, according to Luke 21:20 through 22, when all things written would be fulfilled. So I hope that gives you a good overview of what that phrase "in a little while" was all about. I appreciate the question from the querist, and also encourage you to watch this video as many times as you need to in order to understand the point. If you have any further questions, be sure and send those to me. So make sure that you subscribe to our YouTube channel. Visit our website at All Things Fulfilled. You can check us out on blogtalkradio.com/eschatology All Things Fulfilled. We're on every single day, and we have lines open where you can ask questions live. So we invite you to tune into that as well. And make sure you leave us comments, pro or con, criticisms or whatever. And we do get both, and we respond to both. So leave those as well. Until next time, I'm William Bell saying you have a very pleasant day, and we'll see you in the next video.